Today we're going to be talking about the PHP programming language. We're going to do a quick introduction to its syntax and how everything is set up. It's a language that I use every day in my job, and with the advent of JavaScript and all of these other awesome tools out there right now, I think it's important that we don't forget some of the big players that have been around for a while, like PHP, and there's been a lot of active development in the community lately. So we're going to jump in. We're going to see what working with PHP looks like. And today we're going to build a interactive photo gallery where you can upload your own photos and view them online. So without further ado, let's get started. So if I pop over here to my slides, like I said, today we're going to be talking about the PHP language. Now, a lot of people want to ask, why PHP? So, there are all of these other awesome tools that I mentioned. There's tons of JavaScript development going on nowadays. Ruby, C#, all sorts of frameworks that are out there that are allowing you to build your application however you want. But PHP itself has gone through a lot of community development in the last few years, and it's become a really robust framework and a really robust choice for developing really any application you need. So one of the great things about PHP is that you have this write once, run anywhere methodology, which you can do through a number of ways. PHP runs natively on a lot of servers. Usually if you set up a Linux or a Ubuntu server, you're going to already have PHP installed. Your CLI on your computer may already have it installed as well. But using this language, you can develop applications for any of these platforms. You can partner PHP with more JavaScript technologies like Electron to be able to bring sort of a desktop experience using web technologies to your project. So I mentioned the active community. One of the big things that has pushed PHP to where it is nowadays is the WordPress content engine. If you go to wordpress.com or wordpress.org, you're going to find a huge number of sites that span all across the internet that run off of WordPress. But more recent years, we've also seen the rise of more popular frameworks such as Laravel, or if you want to dig really down into the lower level of your application, there's also Symfony or CodeIgniter. So primarily, I work with Laravel in my day-to-day job. They have a lot of really awesome packages that I recommend checking out. And if you haven't ever used it, I think it's something that's really easy and really fun to get started with. So like I said before, PHP is one of the big players in this space, and a lot of websites run off of WordPress. So much so that W3 Tech actually says that PHP is running on 80% of websites that exist out on the internet today. So one of the big things that you can think that has been built using PHP is Facebook, obviously. Zuckerberg was really ingrained with the PHP language at his time at Harvard. And so being able to pump out an application like Facebook, even at a small scale, just really shows the dynamic use of the language and all the really cool things that you can do with it. Some of the other websites that you'll see out there that are built off of the PHP language is Microsoft's own website. It primarily runs off of PHP, as well as Wikipedia and MediaWiki, which is the project that underpins Wikipedia as a whole. So if you're excited about getting involved with a language that is out there in the world already, works just about anywhere, and has a ton of active community development, then I really think that this language is for you. And so hopefully today, going through this photo gallery example, you'll get an idea of what working with that looks like and, maybe what it can do for you. So like I said before, we're going to talk about this photo gallery. We're also going to touch on some really cool front-end technologies that aren't necessarily PHP, such as Tailwind. It's a CSS framework, whereas a lot of people are used to using Bootstrap or maybe Bulma. Tailwind is just another offering in that same category that's going to provide us a really nice and crisp layout for our project using a lot of pre-made styles that just kind of work out of the box. So without further ado, I guess let's get started. So if I pop over to my editor, you'll see here that I already have a basic HTML template. So this is your index.html file. And in here, I've went ahead and just defined a basic header section with a title for my page, and then spitting out the hello world content down in the body. So to see what that looks like, let's take a look over here. You'll get your plain Jane unstyled H1 heading. And so that this file gives us a really great starting off point on how we're going to develop our application from here. So let's get started. We're going to work on creating an upload button first and styling that and just kind of getting the front end of our application laid out fairly quickly. So like I mentioned before, we're going to use Tailwind CSS. And so to import Tailwind CSS into your project, what we're going to do is we're just going to drop in a CDN link right here into the head section, and that's going to automatically grab Tailwind styles out from the internet. It's going to pull them into your website, and it's going to apply those styles to everything below it. So if we go ahead and pull in that CDN, and then we flip back to our browser, and I refresh the page, you'll notice that not much changes, but that's because we haven't actually applied any of our Tailwind styles to our elements as a whole. You'll see that the font size changed, and that's because Tailwind automatically does a reset process that will apply the same styles across all of your browsers. So whether or not you're working in Firefox, Internet Explorer, or Chrome, you can be confident that how your web page looks in one of those browsers is going to be fairly consistent across all of the other ones. So it really helps ease out that worry about all of these different clients and platforms and how do I manage IE11 concerns and all that. Tailwind does all of that for you. So to see an example of how we're going to apply Tailwind to our classes, we're going to take this H1 element and I'm going to add a class attribute. And here we can just toss in the CSS classes that Tailwind provides. So one of these things that we might do is we might want to make our text a little larger. Let's say that we also want to make it italic. And we're also going to maybe change our font to be, semi-bold, something that doesn't stick out way too much. So if I save that and I flip back over to my browser, we're going to refresh the page and see that those styles were applied. I can go ahead and zoom in here so that's easier to see. So the way that Tailwind works is you have these pre-made classes out of the box that help provide a lot of really default stylings that you're going to apply to your elements. The way that I like to look at this is more that you're not necessarily writing your CSS or you're not writing out how your web page is exactly going to look, but you're more or less configuring your CSS. There are all of these different styles and attributes that you may want to apply. You may want to wrap this in a card and have rounded corners. Well, to do that, you can just add the class rounded, and it will go ahead and round those corners for you. So much like Bootstrap and how it provides a lot of out-of-the-box stylings that just seem to work, Tailwind does the same, and it's a really fun technology that I'm a huge fan of. So to get started with our actual upload button and what our photo gallery is going to look like, we need to just start from the bare basics. So we're going to go ahead and delete that H1 element. We're going to pop on over to our body element, which is going to apply these styles to the entire page as a whole. So applying these to the entire page as a whole, we're going to be able to do some things like change the background color. So maybe we want to have our background just a little bit gray. The white is pretty stark, especially with our black text. So it can help provide a little accent there. So the way that Tailwind's coloring system works is you have the ability to specify how you're going to apply this color to the element. And so, like I said, this gets really into the configuration of your CSS more than actually writing it out. So for instance, if I have that text element and I want to change the color to blue, I will write text dash blue dash and then my modifier. As similarly, if I want to change the background, I'll punch in bg dash blue dash my modifier. Now, what are these modifiers, you might ask? So Tailwind has a color palette defined for each color that gives you a wide array of shades and hues and tones that you can apply to your project, being confident that, again, these are going to work across all different browsers, and it's going to be very easy to configure what exactly things look like. So the way those modifiers work is traditionally you're going to have a 100 to 900 scale. So if I take this page and I set the background to gray 100, and then I flip over to my browser, I'm going to hit refresh. And what you might notice is that the background is just a little bit more gray. But maybe we don't want something that light. Maybe we want it a lot darker. So we have this 100 to 900 scale that we can move our classes along. So if I want to punch in maybe gray 700, it's going to give me a much darker tone than what I had before. So if I refresh that page as well, you'll now see that we have this really nice, crisp, almost dark mode-like gray that's very fun to use. But for right now, I'm going to punch that back to BG Gray 100 just to kind of give us a very nice and crisp, clean layout that we're going to work with today. So maybe we want to do some other things. So if I hit F12 and I open up my inspector, we can inspect our body element and see that it's not that big. There's not much going on there. We don't have any content. So we see that up here at the top left, that our body element is 617 pixels wide, as big as this preview area. But then we don't have any height since we don't have any content within. So if I add in my content again, so if I just add a p tag that says hello, and then refresh, we're going to see that height change as well. So suddenly, that body element now has 24 pixels of height. So this gets into how do we want to lay out our application? I think it would be really nice if we were able to place a big upload button right smack dab in the middle of our page. But to do that, how are we going to actually center this content if our content doesn't actually fit the bounds of our web page, of the container? So to do that, we can pop back over to our editor. And there's a number of ways you can do this, but the easiest one to make your page just fill the height of your browser with Tailwind is just to add this hScreen class. So what this will do is this will tell your element to render itself at the same height as your screen. Similarly, if you want other options, you can do hFull, which will fill the parent container. So maybe you have something that is 300 pixels high and you want something within that to fill that space as well. That's where you would use hFull. There are also out-of-the-box static sizes that you can set. So maybe you want to do H96, and that will correspond to 96 rim elements, which is, I think, roughly 1 to 2 pixels, depending on what device you're viewing it on. So you can very, very dynamically configure, the height of your elements, the background colors, the text colors, really any aspect of your CSS just by modifying these little modifiers here and there within your classes. So Tailwind makes this really easy to work with. So punching that back to hScreen, we're going to now refresh our page, and we're going to see that now this body element fills up the container. We have this big blue block that fills the whole page when we hover over body. And so that's going to give us a great starting point for how we're going to position the content within of it. So this gets into CSS display types, and there's lots of ways that you can display your elements. You can display them in line with other ones. You can have block elements that kind of take up the whole width that's available to them. However, you can also have flex elements. And so what flex elements do is they will allow you to dynamically position the content within it very easily and very robustly with just a few keystrokes. So to make our body a Flux container, what we're going to do is we're going to add the Flux class, and then we want to position everything within. So maybe I want to put it in the middle. So we're going to put item center. If I go back to my browser and refresh that, what that's going to look like is that's going to take my hello tag that I have up here, and then that's going to stick that right down here in the middle. Now, how do you actually get this content to shift over to the middle of the page? Well, if you think about a traditional text document, and that's really all HTML is a markup language. Traditionally, how you would center or position these elements is using some sort of justify method. So just like how in Google Docs or any other text editor that you have the option to justify your text or justify an image or justify an element, you can do that in HTML as well using Tailwind CSS. So we have our items centered vertically in our container. Now to center them horizontally, we're going to justify that. So we can just add justify dash center. Now if we go back over and hit refresh, we're going to see that that hello tag is now going to make its way to the center of this page. So the way that looks is like so. So really great way to be able to center content dynamically using Tailwind. Now, traditionally in CSS, you're going to deal with a lot of headaches when it comes to centering something both vertically and horizontally. Usually you have to deal with absolute positions and calculating the width of your elements and offsetting and all sorts of headache. So using something like Bootstrap, using something like Tailwind, I heavily recommend for anyone who's just getting out there or even just seasoned professionals who just don't want to write their CSS. So it provides just a super quick, easy way to be able to just configure how your application looks in just a few keystrokes. So now that we've got this element positioned, we need to actually work on turning this into what's going to eventually become our upload form and maybe even our gallery view of the photos that we upload to our server. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take an element and we're just going to pop it down in the middle of this body. So I'm going to make a div and I'm going to turn this into a card that's going to contain our button. So how does a card look? Well, right now our background's gray, so we want to have some sort of differentiating aspect. We're going to make our background white. We're going to have those rounded corners that we mentioned earlier. Maybe I want to add a shadow. And then I want to add padding all the way around, just to kind of fill out some space around my card from the content within. So to do that, I'm just going to add a P-8 class. Similarly, if I want to just do that on the horizontal axis or the vertical axis, X and Y, I can change this to PX-8 and maybe PY-4. There's lots of ways that you can configure that. So if I go ahead and save that as P-8, I'm going to add in my text element that was there just a minute ago. So if I say hello again, and then go back to my browser and refresh it, I'm actually going to configure that to auto refresh. So there's our card, wrapping our element, making it nice and clean and professional. And so now let's get started on what's going to become the bulk of our project. So one thing that we want to start off with is we want to first create a button. So what this button is going to do is we're going to show how we can take this button and how we can tie it into the JavaScript portion of our front end. Now you may be asking, like, we're working with PHP. What does JavaScript have to do with this? So PHP is a language that primarily resides on the back end of your website, and JavaScript is something that's going to be primarily on the front end of your website. So you might have JavaScript handle animations, updating elements, things that wouldn't take a full page refresh. But if you're actually transmitting data between the server and the front end, then you're going to need some way to do that. You could use JavaScript. You can use technologies like Ajax or WebSockets to be able to pass that data along dynamically. But most browsers, I'd venture to say all browsers, have built-in support for PHP. So one thing you can do is use PHP to both template your front end and then provide data transmission back and forth. But for right now, we're going to just talk about JavaScript. We're going to make a little script in our our markup. And what this is going to do is we're going to actually set an event listener on this button that will output something whenever we click it. So to have a little bit of reactivity to our website, we're going to show how that can be done. So I'm going to first by grabbing an instance of the element that is actually going to be our button. So to do that, you can do document.get element by ID. And then I'm going to give that an ID of my button. Now, right now, it doesn't have one, so we can add that. I can call this, I'll just call it click me. So if I grab that element and save it, and then I console log out, I'll save that to a variable. I actually console log out that variable, and then we, again, refresh our page. What that will do is this should react every time that we click this button. So I'm going off my auto refresh because it's not playing nice. So if we open up our inspector here, and I click on this button in the middle that says click me, we should see something spit out. Actually, we will not, because I just grabbed the instance of the element and printed it out to the console, but this script runs every time that the page loads. So if you want an action to run when you click a button, you don't necessarily want it to run every time the page loads. So how do we tie those two things together? Well, JavaScript and your browser natively has an event system built into it. So one way that you can do this is just directly on your button element. You can go on here and you can do on change equals, and you can actually punch in JavaScript here and it will just work. So if I do on change and I do console.log hello, I'm sorry, on click. So we can console log hello. If I go back to my browser and I click this button, down in the bottom right, you'll see that I have hello pop up. Let me see if I can turn off the stacking. Oops. So group similar. There we go. So there, every time that I click this button, we're going to have a message pop out to our console. So, but maybe you don't always want to have this logic right here in your HTML element, because if you have more complex logic going on, maybe you need to validate fields, maybe in a form, maybe you need to apply an animation. You need to do something more heavy with JavaScript. It's not really going to make sense to spit out, 20 to 50 lines of JavaScript within this attribute on your HTML element. So going back down to where we had the script tag before, I'll go ahead and define that as JavaScript. I'll again get the element that makes up our button, get element by ID, and then I'm going to punch in the ID that I have assigned to that button. So now we want to do something with this button whenever we click it. So luckily, JavaScript provides this onClick method. So just like how you can apply it to your element, you can apply it to your element in JavaScript as well. And you'll actually pass in a function. So that will give you an event, which we're going to call E. And then from there, I can console.log E and save this. Now, this function that we've defined here, or this method, will run every time that we click that button. So if I go back here, hit refresh, we're going to go through and get an error because button.onClick is not a function. So let's see what we can do. We can do button dot On is not on. Let me look. I'm sorry. It is button.add event listener. So when you click a button or when you change a form element, your browser is going to dispatch an event that has whatever that action was as the name. So like how you had onClick on your HTML element up here. Similarly, if this was a form element, that's going to spit out a change event or any other custom event that your logic or your application puts out, you can do that as well. You can do onChange. You're going to do onChange just like you would onClick, and that's going to work as well. So the general logic is that it's going to be on whatever your event name is. So if we go back to our button and we change this to add event listener and we give it the click event, so then there we can tie this logic to whenever we click this button. So go ahead and save that. Go back, refresh. I'm now going to click this button and it's going to spit out hello, just like it did before. But we've now moved that logic up here where you defined the button to further down at the bottom of the page where you have more room to add more complex logic. So now that we have this in place and we can trigger events from our HTML elements, we're going to see how we can maybe turn this into an upload form and trigger events based on what the user does when it comes to that. So we're going to start by changing our button to an input. So if we go up here, we can do input, and then we can give it a type of file. We need to give it an ID. We'll call it photo. We're going to give it a name. That can also be photo. Traditionally, your name and your ID are going to be pretty similar. And then that should be it. So if we save that, we go back to our browser, refresh. We're going to have two things happen. Number one, we're going to have this file uploader pop up. And then we're also going to have an error thrown because our button's not defined anymore. So if I click an image and I click a file to upload, it's going to give me the file preview. And then we need to have our page react in some way to this image being selected. So the general layout that we're going to give our upload form is we're going to have the upload section where a user can select their file. And then we're going to have a button below it that dynamically hides and shows based on whether or not the user has selected a file. So this will allow us to basically make sure that you can't submit the form without having selected an image that you're going to process for uploading. So the next step that we're going to do is we're going to go back to our editor and we're going to go in here and we're going to update our JavaScript to attach its event listener to this new file upload form. So I'm going to call this upload element. And then I change this to upload element. I'm going to change my ID that is referenced by. So our new ID is just called photo. So we should be able to save this and go back and see what that looks like. So if we now select our button, we're going to get hello. And I can pick an image, and it's going to go ahead and update that preview text as well. And since we clicked on the button, it spits out and runs that JavaScript that we defined at the bottom of our page. So if I click this button again, it's going to spit out hello one more time. Now, we don't necessarily want an event to fire when we click that button. Because what a user might do is they might go in here and they might think, I can't find the photo that I was going to upload. I'm just going to hit cancel. But all the logic that we've put in here is just going to continue to run. So we're going to turn this logic into what's going to eventually control the show state of our button. And we need that to happen when a user has selected a file and in no other instance. So it doesn't really make sense to have this run every time you click this button. So what's a strategy that we can do to approach this? We can go back to our editor and we can actually change this click element to change. So what this will do is this will actually run this event listener not when the button is clicked, but when the actual content of the input changes. And that content is going to be the files that we select. So now when we do this, we can go back to our browser. We'll refresh. And then when we click our image, we're going to click the choose file. We're going to select an image. And then it ran after we selected something. Now, this also works, again, if we don't select anything. And that's because this input is changing from having one file to having 0 files. So here is where we can start getting into the logic of what is actually going to control the form on our page and how we're going to present that. So real quick, we have our input. We're going to go ahead and add another button to submit. So we're going to type in submit. So we want this button to, I'll give it a background of blue. I'll make it a block element so it takes up the whole width. I'm going to add white text and I'm going to add rounded corners. So if we just go ahead and see what that looks like, we're going to refresh the page and our button is not visible. Now, why is this? I'm going to go in here to our inspector. We're going to see that our button does not have a valid background. So it's because we didn't add this modifier for our blue to specify what shade that we wanted. So if we change this to 100, and then our block element will actually just tell our button to be on basically a new line as our input form. But it doesn't tell it to necessarily take up the whole width. So we're also going to add in a w-full class here. So we'll add w-full. You can see here where I added the 100 modifier. And we're actually going to make that a little bit darker. We're going to make that 600. To go back to our browser.
There was a question from Alex on Twitch about the input needing to be inside of a form element.
Yes, so we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Right now, I'm just showing a basic layout of how we're going to lay out this page. And then I'll get into the form elements and how we're actually going to connect that to our PHP later on in the talk. So we have this submit button and this element set up here to pick our image so far. We need to go ahead and add a little spacing. So just like how I mentioned earlier about padding and how you can do px-8 to set your internal padding. You can do py to set your internal vertical padding. You can also apply this to margins as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be X or Y. You can specify T for top, B for bottom, L for left, and R for right. But we're just going to apply a basic top margin to the submit button. And that's going to give us a little bit more space to work with when it comes to seeing how our card layout is done. So there we go. We've got ahead and got that element working, and we've got this looking pretty good. Now, again, like I said earlier, we're going to want to hide the submit button if the user hasn't necessarily selected an image so far. So what we're going to do is we're going to give that an ID as well. We're going to call that submit I'm actually going to call that submit button. And we're going to get an instance of that down in our JavaScript as well. I keep having trouble flipping back and forth. So submit element. And again, we're going to reach out to the document. We're going to get an element by the ID. And we're just going to get submit button. So now that we have this imported into our JavaScript, we can now dynamically do things with it. So one thing that we might do is we might want to submit element. We may want to change the style. So let's say we're just going to set the display to none. Okay, so now if I refresh the page, we're going to go back in here. Nothing's changed because that JavaScript in our event listener has not ran yet. So we can click an image. We can click choose file. We can select an image. And since that element changed, that event listener ran, and then it set our submit button to have a display type of none. So it disappears. But we kind of want this to be in the opposite. And we also want this to react when there aren't any files that are selected, maybe by clicking choose file and then clicking cancel. So to do this, we're going to go back to our JavaScript and we're going to see how we can interact with this input element that we've specified up at the top. So our upload element is where all of our files are getting uploaded to. That's this right here. So one thing we can do is we can just count how many files are attached to that element. So if I click cancel, there's going to be 0. But if I open up my file picker and I select 1 image or 2 images, then that's going to update to whatever that number is. So to do that, you can get your upload element. You can do dot files dot length, and then that will tell you how many files are uploaded, are selected to upload. So we want to have 2 use cases. We want to do something when files are selected. We also want to do something when files are not selected. The one thing we might do in this case is we might set our submit element. We might set the display to block. That's going to tell the element to be visible on the page when we have more than one, or if we have more than 0 files selected. And if we don't have any selected, we're just going to set that to none. So if I go back to my browser, yes, it is. So I'm going to refresh time just to fix that typo. And then now you'll see that even though we don't have any files selected with this element, our submit button is still visible. So that's not really the behavior we want. And it's because that event listener has not ran to actually tell this button to hide itself or show itself. So to fix this, we can actually do this in Tailwind, or you can do it just by adding a style class to your element. So you could do style equals display none. Or similarly, in Tailwind, you could do hidden, but then you're going to have to alter your logic down here to actually remove that class. So if we just stick with the plain style element or a plain style attribute and set our display type to none by default, this will ensure that when the page first loads, that button's not going to be visible unless we want it to be. So if I go back here, I'm going to refresh, and we're going to see the submit button disappear. So what we can do is we can now select a picture from our file picker. And then if that file count that I've selected is greater than 0, it's going to show that button. Similarly, if I go back in here and I decide I don't want to upload one and hit cancel, that's going to disappear. So now that we've got that hide show state working, this is really it when it comes to picking out what we're going to do in terms of this form and how we're going to present that on the front end. Now, how do we actually do something with this form? It's kind of tricky to get an instance of our file in JavaScript and then package that up over Ajax or WebSockets or any other protocol to be able to get that data to our backend. So thankfully, a lot of browsers nowadays have built-in support for PHP, like I mentioned before. So like that viewer suggested, we're going to now wrap this button and this element in what's called a form element. And a form element just provides an easy way for you to basically define inputs, define buttons, and have those execute some action when you submit the form. So one thing that we have to do is we have to wrap this element in a form block. And then on our button down here, we're going to actually tell this button that it is the submit handler for this form. So now, if I go back to my browser, you're going to see that nothing has changed. We have the same layout. We have the same elements. If I pick an image and I queue that for upload and I hit submit, that form is just going to reload the page. It's not going to do anything with it because we haven't pointed that form to where it actually needs to direct that content to. So it just falls back to whatever the current page is. So to specify what that action is, we're going to actually go in here on this form element, and we're going to add an action attribute. We're going to point that at the PHP script where we're going to handle the logic for uploading our image. So to do that, we're just going to type in upload.php. This is a file we haven't created yet. We also need to set the method to post to make sure that it performs a post request that contains all of our data packaged up really nicely for the backend. And then since we are also uploading an image and it's a binary file, this is just kind of an edge case, you have to add this encoding type to your form element so that the browser actually knows how do I break this image down into a format that I can pass along to the backend. So to do that, we're going to save those elements. We're going to go back to our browser and refresh. And now, if I select an image, I'm going to see my submit button pop up. I'm going to hit submit, and it's going to take me to an unknown page because we have not defined that yet. Hold on one second. My editor just crashed. Real quick, while I get this back up, does anyone else have any questions they can shoot my way? Anything that anyone is struggling with or I can clarify?
There was a question in the Twitch chat about whether PHP is more efficient than Node for the backend.
So it really depends on your use case and really what you're trying to tackle when it comes to developing your application. So, for instance, myself, I work at WellCaddy, which is an industrial IoT provider here in Norman, Oklahoma. And so we use a lot of PHP on the back end for things you traditionally wouldn't use it for. We're doing data analysis, we're doing predictions, we're doing a lot of things that you would traditionally outsource to JavaScript tools. But like I mentioned before, there's been a lot of active community development over the last few years. Personally, I think that PHP is pretty on par when it comes to JavaScript for a lot of use cases. PHP is really great for clarity, being able to write out your content that's going to go on your page, templating that, handling a lot of functional work on the back end, you're going to be able to do all of that with PHP as well as Node. So if you're doing something that's maybe more lower level, maybe you want to instill TensorFlow or some other machine learning tools. Maybe you want to work with Express because you really like how small the JS package size is. It really just depends on whatever your use case is. But generally, for the most part, PHP is pretty on par nowadays. You even have technologies like Laravel Livewire, which is a package that will let you handle a lot of your front end logic that would traditionally be outsourced to JavaScript, like this button showing or hiding. With something like Livewire, you're going to be able to do that in all PHP on your backend. So really, just if you have something that is very JavaScript specific, that's the way to go. Similarly with Python or Django, then yeah, you have that use case. Otherwise, I think it's just whatever you're most familiar programming in, and wherever you're more excited to be a part of the community. So that's really my answer on that. Like I said, I love PHP. I'm a PHP evangelist. I work in it every day, and it's really exciting to me that I can functionally do just about everything I need to do in PHP. So where your full stack might include your HTML, your PHP on the back end, your JavaScript on the front end, and whatever external tools you have. PHP is very much at the point now where you can use that all the way through. You can write your content in just PHP on the front end if that's what you want. You can intermingle that with HTML. You can do PHP on the front end with animations and showing and hiding elements. You can do PHP on the back end. You can even use PHP to call out to external services. So if I need to make an API call, or if I need to maybe run a process on the server, you can do all of that in PHP, just the same as Node or JS. But getting back to the project. So if we go ahead and take a look at this browser, we were running into this issue because we submitted our form, but it's pointed to this upload.php file that we haven't defined yet. So the error I'm getting here is just from my web server, and it's telling me, hey, that page isn't found. So jumping back into VS Code, let me try and fix that. Okay. There we go. So now that we've got our editor back up and running, we can go ahead and add in this upload.php file. So we can just stick that right alongside our index.html. And since they're both in the same directory, it's just going to point right to that. So you've got your JavaScript on the front end. You've got your HTML for your content. How do we actually handle data on the back end? So to start with the PHP file, you're just going to pop it open with open bracket, question mark, PHP. You'll see in a lot of tutorials online, they'll also have you closing with the PHP tag. It's worth noting that if you're just in a purely static PHP file and you don't have any other content mingled in, like HTML or JavaScript or whatever, you can just go ahead and leave that off. And so it also provides a performance benefit at some point in a larger project because you can basically include classes within one another. So to get started with the backend and what our PHP looks like, we're just going to run a command here on the backend. So like on JavaScript, you might have console.log to echo out some information of the console. In PHP, you're just going to have echo. So you can type in hello world, save that. And then now when I access my upload.php file, I just went ahead and refresh the page. Then it's going to pop up that hello world. But we want it to actually do something with the content that we have passed to that file. So To do that, we're going to go back to our browser, and we're going to talk about special variables in PHP. So PHP was built to be a templating engine for your HTML. It was built to allow you to handle these form uploads. It's built to allow you to swap out content on a page dynamically based on maybe a database call or some other data structure that you have in mind. So the way that PHP stores a lot of this content is in these global $_ variables. So one that's worth noting is file. Let me double check that. It's files. And so what that's going to do is this is going to be just sort of like a generalized container where all of our files that we sent to the backend are gonna get shoved in. You'll notice that a lot in PHP that all variables are prepended with $. So PHP is type agnostic, which means that if you want, you can define a variable as specific type, like a string or an int or whatever. If this is within a class, so I could do like public, string, whatever. But you can also just do type juggling, and you can leave this blank as well. So $_files is an instance of this global variable that you have access to when you execute your PHP script. So to see what that looks like, we can actually dump out what that variable's structure is using the var dump method. And so if we pass in $files and I go back to my browser, I'm just going to refresh this page. And what you're going to see is there's going to be the photo that we uploaded. Now, if I just went to this URL in a new tab, the browser has not cached that image yet from my previous page. So if I just navigate to that directly, you're going to see that we have 0 files available to PHP. But if I go back here to my upload page and I have an image selected and I click submit, then what that's going to do is that's going to add that file information to whatever this array is. So here we have a lot of useful attributes. We have a name of the photo. We have the file type. We have a temporary directory where it's already been uploaded to our server. And then we have any errors that we might have ran into, as well as the size of the file. So there's some interesting things you can do with this. One of the first things we're going to do is we're going to grab an instance of the files that we uploaded. So we just uploaded one image. So we're going to reach out to _files. And if you'll notice here in the browser, I've left this up so you can see that this files element is an array with one element. And the first thing that it points to is this photo. Now, photo, if you remember, is the name of our file upload. So we can rename this to my photo. And similarly, we can go back into PHP. We can get an array key of my photo. And that's going to give us just the information for that one file that we've uploaded, rather than a wide array of files that you might upload in a larger form. You might have more than one. And so this is how you're going to differentiate between those forms. So if we dump out the content of what that image is again, and we refresh our page, you're going to see that there was an undefined index, and it was because I believe I have to change the ID as well. So if I refresh that again, no. So let's take a look at what's going on. So if I've renamed my element to my photo, Similarly, down here, I have to update my JavaScript as well. So it will affect my event listener. So then now, if I go back into PHP and I dump out just all of the images that were uploaded, go back to our browser, we're going to see it's still called photo. Not sure. I think so. Let me do a full page refresh and see if that helps. I think what it was is when I was going back, you're right. The browser had already cached what that element looked like and it hadn't updated the syntax. So now if I upload this, yep, there we'll go. We get the my photo array key. And again, we can go back here and restore our code to get just the details for that one image. So if I pop back to my browser, we now have just the singular array rather than a nested array. And that's going to give us our name, our file type, where it's uploaded, any errors we have, and the size of the image. So now that we're on the back end, we're running this code on the server. This is no longer in the user's browser. What can we do with this image? Well, we're gonna have to store it somewhere. So to create a little space for that, we're gonna go to VS Code and we're gonna add a folder alongside our files called images. So what images is gonna do is that's gonna be basically the repository where we upload these photos, and then we're going to pull them back out to display on our front end for later. So first, you want to do something like maybe define where are we going to stick these images. Well, I have a folder called images, so I'll specify that. I also want to define where do I want to stick this image. So I want to stick it in my target directory. Then I want to add a directory separator. Actually, we can skip that because I've added this backslash here. If I take that out, what this will do is this stores the string images in our target directory variable. Now, we want to define our target file as something like images slash the images file name dot the image extension. So to do this dynamically, depending on where you run your PHP, you might have it on a Windows server, you might have it on a Linux server, you might have it on some other system that maybe doesn't like forward slashes as its directory separator. PHP provides you sort of an all-encompassing variable where you can just punch that in, separator, and it will handle that forward slash or converting it to a backslash automatically for you. Similarly, we also want to define what this file name .extension is. If we go back to our browser, we can see that we already have that information from our file name. So going back to VS Code, we can just define that as image and then get the attribute of name. So now I'm going to basically echo out what these variables are just so we can make sure that this is what we want. So upload directory is going to concat the string using a dot, whereas in JavaScript you might use a plus. So dot, and then target directory. We're going to do the same for our file, and our uploaded file will be target file. So if we see what that looks like, we can see that our variables, oops, looks like our direct, yep. Help me out, Chris. I am not on my spelling game today. P-A-R-A. Verify that. A-R-A-T-O-R. Yep, you are right. So if I refresh that as again, we should get that error knocked out. So it looks like PHP still is not liking this. Cancel that. Okay, so let's see. Yep, I had it misspelled all around. So let's try that one more time. Actually, that looks like. Yep, that worked. So I'm going to add a new line to our first echo statement, just so we can see that in a more readable format. And Chrome is going to prompt me every time I refresh the page, whether or not I want to include that image that I included from my upload form before. So adding in that new line and then refreshing one more time, we will see that our upload directory is going to be images, which is correct, and our uploaded file will correspond to what that file name was when we uploaded it. So now that we've got the basic information about our image, where it's going, what it's going to be named, let's actually let's get this working. So if I take if I go into my PHP file, PHP has an internal method called move uploaded file. What you're going to do is you're going to give that the location where the image is currently uploaded. If you remember from inspecting our image variable, there's a temp name attribute that corresponds to where it resides on the server currently before being moved to your final destination. So we want to move that to our target file location. So I'll also change my target file to include the target directory. That way, if we change our directory, our target file name will change as well. So if I go back and I refresh the page one more time, I'm going to add a little echo done statement. I'm going to refresh the page. It's going to ask me to reattach that image I had selected. I did that, and it says done. So now if we go back to VS Code and we look over here in our images directory, there's now the image that we uploaded. So this is great. You now have a working example where you have a form that will allow you to select a photo. It will dynamically show or hide the submit button. That way you're not making any empty calls to your backend PHP file. And then you have PHP on the server that is parsing information about this image and then turning around and actually executing actions on that image and doing something with it in one way or another. So this gives us a great MVP on getting something done and actually doing something with the file that you've given the server. But let's get a little bit more in the weeds. Maybe you want to restrict what you can upload. So just because we have defined here in our PHP file that the name of the variable is image, over here in our HTML, we have it called my photo, but there's actually nothing to prevent a user from coming in to the website and uploading any file they want. So maybe I have and that's an image, so that works fine for our example. But maybe I want to I want to upload just a plain file. So I'm going to upload a file called upload.php. And that's going to, if we go back into VS Code, we're going to see that reflected in our images directory as well. So how do we restrict the user input or validate it to make sure that we are only getting images that we want? Well, there's two ways that you can do this. One way that we can do this is we can limit this on the front end, where the form will actually refuse to submit unless it's a proper file type. We can also do this on the back end, where the back end will actually throw an error if we give it a file that it didn't really quite expect. So on your HTML element for your input, your file input, you can actually do an accept attribute, and you can pass that image type. So we can do image dash GIF, image slash JPEG. We can do image slash PHP. And so now, if we go back into our browser, we go to our upload page and we select a file, you'll now notice that when this file picker pops up, you're going to have this custom files attribute set. And as you navigate across the web, you'll notice that this is the case all over when it comes to different types of websites. They provide a lot of flexibility in how you can limit the files that you can upload. So just like how earlier we saw all of these different files in this folder, we now see just a handful of just images. So if I go back into my images, we can now upload that. That'll work great. You can go into VS Code, verify that that image was uploaded. But then now, if we go back, we select a different file. So let's say we want to pick I want to flip this to all files and override that setting. And again, let's say I want to upload just a text file. Well, it's going to tell us done. Oh, it actually did upload. And so that's because our front end validation can be overridden by the user. So you saw how I clicked custom files, I clicked all files, and I was able to pick a text file despite the input element telling me that I can't. So the way to fix this is you also have to duplicate this logic on the back end of your server as well. So in your upload.php file, you're going to add in right here in the middle a way to check if the image is a valid file. So to do this, we can get the extension of the image. So one way we can do that is we can define another variable up here called image extension. And PHP has a method called path info. We can go ahead and pass in the name of our file that we uploaded. We can tell path info that we only want the extension because it will give you other statistics such as the size, maybe header information, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to get your image extension. And so for instance, this may be something like PNG. It may be .jpeg, like we saw with the text file, and maybe .txt. But file extensions are also not case sensitive. So this may also be capital TXT or capital PNG. So one way that we can make sure that this is always in lowercase is just by, again, modifying this same variable. We'll just reassign it one more time. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use the string to lower function that PHP provides. Pass in the previous version of this variable, and we'll save that. So now this will make sure that whatever our extension is will always be lowercase. So dot capital PNG will get turned into dot lowercase PNG. So now, if we want to check if our image is a valid file type, what we can do is we can say if in array image extension, that's the extension from the file we uploaded, and then accepted extensions, then it will allow us to check if our file extension is within this variable, and if it is, then we know that the file is good. Now, we haven't defined this accepted extensions variable, so let's go ahead and do that. We'll add another line down here, and we can make that an array. And we want to allow JPEG. Now, JPEG has 2 file extensions, so we'll define both of those. We want to allow PNGs. We want to allow GIFs. So since we know that if this condition passes, that the file is going to be a valid image, we can now move this uploaded file into here. We can echo out a success message. So, yay, it worked. And then here we're going to do echo, sorry, not an image. So again, if we go back to our original upload page, we want to select an image, and then I'm going to give it a text file this time. And by doing that, I'm going to hit submit, and it's going to say undefined function path info. That's because I misspelled that method signature. So it's going to be path info, one word, instead of having the underscore in there. I'll just go ahead and refresh this and resubmit the same image or the same file. It's going to tell me, hey, sorry, that's not an image. So we now have some sort of validation working. If I go back here and I upload a proper image, then we can be confident that that's going to work out fine. We'll go ahead and pick another one of our characters here. We'll hit submit, and it's going to tell us, yay, it worked. And if we flip all the way back to VS Code, then we'll see that the image we just selected is uploaded there. So there we go. We have validation working on whether or not this extension, whether or not the file extension is a valid image. Now, what are some other validation methods that you might want to implement? Well, you don't want to run out space on your server too quick, so you might have statement that checks file size. You'll have an extension to, or you'll add an if statement to check if it has a valid extension. And then you'll also want to check if maybe you've already uploaded the file. So check if file already exists. So there are a number of ways you can do this. So to check if the file already exists, PHP just provides that method for you. You can type in file exists. You can give it an image. And you don't want to actually check the name of your image because that will look in this root directory. So instead what you're going to do is you're going to give it your target file. And that's going to tell it to look in the images directory, and it's going to append whatever the file you just uploaded was, and it's going to search for that. So if the file exists, you know that, sorry, file already exists. Okay, yeah. So since we've done that, we can check if the file exists, and then we can just go ahead and exit the script. Similarly, if we want to check the image size, you're going to check if it's greater than how many megs you want times 100,000, because that's the conversion rate to bytes. And you're going to say echo file too big, and then exit back there. So there you go. That covers those two cases, whether or not it already exists, and if the file was able to upload properly. So now that we've done that, how do we get the images back to our front end? So to speed this along, I'm going to punch in this photo gallery element. And so what this does is this will allow us to embed PHP within our HTML. So just like how you'll have this PHP run when this file is loaded, you can also have PHP embedded in your HTML that's going to run when your HTML file is loaded by your browser. So to do that, we'll stick in our PHP. We'll rename this file to index.php. And then we'll check if this variable is empty. And if it's not, then we're going to loop over these variables and we're going to spit out an image. So I mentioned before, you can use PHP for your templating. This is the way to do it. So you'll have a PHP if statement. You'll stick your HTML in there. Inside that, this is a wrapper for the grid that we're going to have. You're going to for each over all of the images that you uploaded. You're going to create another HTML element, and then you're going to actually spit out the file name, and then you're going to do that in a link tag and the image tag to show it on your front end. So you can also take your PHP, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in your body. You can stick it up here on your head as well. So I've added this this PHP, and what this will do is this will look in the images directory. It will scan over it. It will get the file name of each file that is within our images directory. It will check if it's a folder, and if it's not a folder, we can assume it's an image because we have this validation on the back end. And then it will push whatever that image is to this array. So then this array can be accessed by this other PHP element down here, where we'll check if this is empty. And if it's not, we'll go ahead and spit out what those images are. I'm going to add some spacing to our form. I'm going to go back to our front end now. When I show this, you'll see these images that we uploaded. If I select a new one and I hit submit, it's going to say, yay, it worked. I'm going to go back to my front page, and there you go. So this has been a super quick and dirty run through of just sort of how you can use PHP, the different things it can do, how it can interact with your front end, how you can have PHP running on both your front end and your back end, allowing you to do some pretty cool things like template out your HTML, or handle file uploads, execute processes on your server, et cetera, et cetera. We went way over time on this talk. That was my fault for not knowing what the time limits were. So hopefully in the future, we'll be able to recap this, go over it in a more robust and clean way. And like I said, if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot them my way. I'll hand it off to Chris or Kimberly.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions. One of them was on that file size, why were you multiplying 10 times some number of zeros?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So real quick here, if we go back into VS Code, I'm going to add those same statements we had earlier that dumps out the info about the file that we uploaded. So if we dump the image that we selected and we go over to our browser, we select a new one, and we hit submit, we're going to get this array. So var dump will just kind of it will use echo to print out the structure of whatever that variable is. And we can see in here that it has a size, and it is set to 25,629. So this is the number of bytes that make up the size of the image. If you look in your file picker, so if I go ahead and open that, and then I navigate to my photos, we can verify that that image is 26 kilobytes. So roughly it's about 1,000 bytes per kilobyte. So what we'll do is we'll go in here, and this is how many kilobytes. So it's 1,000 bytes per kilobyte. So if we want to limit our file size to 1 kilobyte, we set it to 1,000. If we want to set it to 10 kilobytes, it's going to be 10 times 1,000. Well, we want to actually allow a user to upload a fairly large file, say 10 megabytes, or on the lower end, maybe 3. So that would be basically this size modifier, because you have 1,000 kilobytes, which goes into a megabyte. Yes. So basically what that is it's just a quick and dirty conversion from bytes to megabytes. So if you say this is 1 megabyte worth of bytes, then we're going to limit that to 10 times that. So this functionally limits our image upload to like 10 megs. So that's where that number comes from.
There's also a question, and Chris did answer it, but for everybody else, can you change a variable's type in PHP?
Yes. So this is what I mentioned about type juggling earlier, and it allows you to do some pretty cool things with sort of like dynamically assigning values to your variable. So let's see. One thing that, let's see if I can find an instance where we've done that. So we haven't. I can set a variable to say a string, like my string, and then I can turn around and reassign that variable any other object. This could be an array, it could be a new class or something. Yeah, PHP allows you to, it's called type juggling. It allows you to assign really whatever you want to that variable, unless you've specifically type hinted it with something like string, my string equals something. And then if I was to assign my string an array, then that wouldn't work.
Okay, so I think that may be the end of our questions. We'll give it just a few more seconds for anybody to post their questions here. We'll be opening the call. Yeah, there's some talk about 1,000 versus 1024 on the previous question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we will be opening the call to anyone who wants to come on and chat about that or any other questions y'all might have. I will post the link in the chat right now. And I think, Bryson, if that's all you got for the stream, we will say goodbye to Twitch. Thank you all for watching, and we will see you all next time. Follow us on Meetup and in Slack to see when all these events are going to be. So thanks for joining.
All right. Thank you.